Eleanor hadn't worn perfume in months, and she almost didn't tonight either. She stood at the bathroom mirror with the small glass bottle in her hand, turning it over, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Spencer used to say he could smell her before he saw her, back when smelling her was something he wanted. 11 months now, since he'd stopped wanting much of anything that had to do with her. She put the bottle down without opening it and went back to the bedroom, where the dinner she'd made was already going cold, on 2 plates she'd set with the good napkins. The ones from their wedding registry that had never actually been used, because Spencer always said cloth napkins were trying too hard for a Tuesday. It wasn't a Tuesday, it was their anniversary. 12 years. She'd told herself she wasn't going to make a thing of it, and then she'd spent the whole afternoon making a thing of it anyway. The chicken piccata he used to request when they were dating, the candles she found in the hallway closet, the napkins. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale, rehearsing what she'd say when he walked in. Not an accusation, she'd decided that much. Just the truth, soft and small. I miss you. I miss who we were. Can we try? She heard his key in the lock at 9:40, 2 hours after he said he'd be home, and every rehearsed word dissolved on her tongue. He came in still wearing his coat, scrolling his phone, not looking at her, not looking at the candles, not looking at the napkins. I'm not hungry, he said, before she'd said a word. Then he noticed the table. He stopped. What is this? An accusation, somehow, like she'd done something wrong by trying. It's our anniversary, Spencer. Something flickered across his face. Not warmth, not even guilt. Irritation, plain and unmistakable. The same look he gave the dry cleaner when they lost a button. Eleanor. He said her name like an apology for something he wasn't actually sorry for. I need to tell you something. She knew. She'd known for weeks, maybe months. The way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes. Some pressure in the air, some wrongness she couldn't name. She'd smelled a perfume on his jacket in March that wasn't hers. She'd told herself it was a colleague, a crowded elevator. Anything but the truth. I want a divorce, he said. I've met someone. I'm in love with her. The room went so quiet, Eleanor could hear the candle wicks crackling. Is this a joke? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. I wouldn't joke about Betrayal. Betrayal. A name, suddenly real suddenly, a person with a face. Eleanor would now spend the rest of the night trying not to imagine. She stood, because sitting felt like agreeing to something. 12 years, Spencer. 12 years, and you're going to stand in our kitchen in your coat and... Don't make this harder than it has to be. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, already creased from being carried around, already prepared. And Eleanor understood with a sick drop in her stomach that he hadn't decided this tonight. He'd decided this weeks ago. The dinner, the candles, the napkins. She'd been setting a table for a man who'd already left. He set the envelope on the counter, on top of the napkins, which felt like its own small cruelty. You'll want a lawyer, he said. I already have one. Spencer, I have somewhere to be. He picked his car keys back up off the hook by the door. The hook she'd installed herself because he always lost his keys, because she'd spent 12 years quietly managing the small chaos of his life so he'd have room to be brilliant at his job. There's a gala tonight, the Whitcomb Foundation thing. I'm taking Betrayal. He said it so plainly. Like he wasn't aware of what each word was doing to her. Like the woman he was leaving for was already a fact of his calendar, already slotted in next to anniversary dinner. Cancel. You're taking her, Eleanor repeated. Tonight. While I'm standing here, there's no good time for this, Eleanor. He didn't look back when he left. The door clicked shut behind him with a softness that felt worse than slamming would have. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, in her good dress, beside 2 plates of chicken piccata going cold under candlelight, holding a stranger's name in her mouth like a stone. She didn't cry right away. She picked up the envelope first, because some part of her needed to see it was real. Her name, Eleanor Marguerite Pierce, typed at the top of a legal document like she was already a case file instead of a person. She folded it in half. She blew out the candles one by one, carefully, like there was still a chance someone would walk back in and need them lit. Then she put on her coat over her dress and walked outside, because the apartment had gotten too small to hold what she was feeling, and the cold March air felt like the only thing big enough. She sat down on the front steps of her building and finally let herself cry. Not the pretty, contained kind of crying, but the kind that comes from somewhere underneath your ribs, that doesn't care who hears it. She cried for the candles. She cried for the napkins. She cried for every night she'd told herself tomorrow would be different. For every dinner that went cold. For every time she'd caught herself in the mirror and thought, quietly, what's wrong with me? When the real answer had never been about her at all. She didn't hear the car until it had already stopped at the curb. You looked like you needed someone to stop, a voice said. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had clearly never had to raise itself to be taken seriously. Eleanor looked up, mortified, swiping at her face with the back of her hand. A black car idled at the curb, engine barely audible. The kind of car that didn't need a logo because everyone who mattered already knew what it was. A man stood beside it in a dark suit, no tie, looking at her not with pity, but with something steadier than that. I'm fine, she said automatically, the lie everyone's. You're not, he said, not unkindly, but you don't have to be out here alone in the cold. She almost laughed, a wet, broken sound. That's one way to put it. He didn't come closer. He crouched down instead, so he was at her eye level instead of looming over her, and waited, hands loose at his sides. No phone, no impatience, just stillness. The kind of stillness that said, I have nowhere else I'd rather be right now, which felt, after the night she'd had, almost unbearably kind. She told him everything. She didn't plan to. Maybe it was because he was a stranger, and strangers can't hold things against you the way people who know you can. Maybe it was because she had nothing left to protect. She told him about the anniversary, the candles, the napkins, the envelope, the name Betrayal sitting in her chest like a splinter. He listened with his whole attention, the way almost no one does anymore, without interrupting, without offering fixes she hadn't asked for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, studying her like she was something he hadn't expected to find on a Tuesday night. Gideon Wren, he said finally, extending a hand. And I have to tell you, in 38 years, I've never sat on a curb with anyone more remarkable than the woman currently apologizing for crying in front of me. She let out a startled laugh. I wasn't apologizing, you were about to. She was. She closed her mouth. I have somewhere I'm supposed to be tonight, he said. A gala. I was dreading it before I got out of this car, and I am dreading it considerably less now. He paused. Come with me. I'm a mess. You're a woman who just found out her husband had been planning his exit for weeks while she set a table for two. His voice didn't soften the truth of it, but it didn't sting either. It was just fact, laid plainly between them, like he respected her too much to dress it up. I think you deserve to walk into a room tonight and remind yourself what it feels like to be looked at properly. She stared at his offered hand for a long moment. Then she took it. In the car, while he gave quiet instructions to his driver about a slight delay, Eleanor texted her sister one line, "Don't worry, I'm okay. Tell you everything tomorrow," and then sat with her hands in her lap, watching the city blur past the window, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been clenched for 11 months. He had his driver stop at her building so she could change, standing in front of her closet, staring at clothes that all felt wrong, all felt like the woman who'd cooked chicken piccata for a man who'd already left her. Eleanor's eyes landed on the garment bag at the very back, the one she hadn't opened since the funeral, her mother's gown. It had come to her 4 years ago, wrapped in tissue paper with a note pinned to the zipper in her mother's looping handwriting. For the night you forget who you are and need reminding. I love you beyond every word I know how to say. Eleanor had never worn it. It felt too important for ordinary nights, and there had never been a night that felt like it deserved the dress. Until now, until the dress had become the only thing in her closet that felt like armor instead of camouflage. It was a deep emerald green, hand-bedded at the bodice, the kind of craftsmanship nobody made anymore, because it took too long and cost too much. Her mother had worn it once to a benefit where, as family legend went, she'd walked in knowing no one and left having been introduced to everyone in the room. Eleanor zipped herself into it with hands that, for the first time all night, weren't shaking. She did her makeup carefully, dark liner, a deep wine lip, her hair twisted up with a few pieces left loose at her jaw the way her mother used to wear hers. When she looked in the mirror, something behind her own eyes had shifted. She wasn't Spencer's wife standing there. She wasn't the woman who'd begged at a kitchen counter. She was her mother's daughter. And underneath the grief and the betrayal, something patient and furious and entirely her own. She slipped the folded divorce papers into her clutch. She didn't fully know why. Only that she wasn't going to leave them on her counter like an unanswered question, and walked back out to the car. The Whitcomb Foundation Gala was held at the Ashworth Grand, a ballroom with ceilings so high they made the chandeliers look almost modest in comparison. Every name that mattered in the city's philanthropic and business circles was there, dressed for it, performing the particular choreography of money, trying to look effortless. Nobody in that room was prepared for what walked through the doors. Gideon Wren entered first, and because he was Gideon Wren, a name attached to more closed deals and quiet acquisitions than most of the room could count. Heads turned the moment he crossed the threshold. He was, everyone there, understood, currently in the final stages of the largest investment his firm had made in a decade, into a development company that half the room had business with, directly or otherwise. And then Eleanor stepped in beside him. The emerald gown caught the chandelier light and held it, the beading shimmering with every step she took. She moved like a woman with nothing left to fear, chin level, her hand resting lightly on Gideon's arm, her gaze sweeping the room with a calm that turned out to be far more arresting than any grand entrance she could have planned. The whole room just stopped talking, Gideon murmured, leaning down slightly. Good, Eleanor said. Across the ballroom, past the champagne towers and the string quartet, two people had gone completely still. Spencer saw her first. He'd been mid-law, one hand resting against the small of Brielle's back, leaning in to murmur something against her ear. And then some current moved through the room, some instinct, and he looked up and saw his wife on another man's arm in a dress he'd never seen, looking like a woman who had never once needed him. The laugh died in his throat. Beside him, Brielle followed his gaze, and her smile didn't fade so much as collapse in real time. She had spent months convincing herself Spencer's wife was a non-factor, unremarkable, easily outshone. She had never been more wrong about anything. Spencer's glass lowered slowly to a passing tray, untouched. He'd been married to Eleanor for 12 years, and he realized, watching her walk into that room, that he had never once seen her look like this, because he had never given her a reason to. Something tightened in his chest that wasn't jealousy. It was worse than that. It was recognition. The specific, sickening clarity of a man understanding, far too late, exactly what he'd thrown away. "Is that your wife?" Brielle asked, her voice gone thin. "Don't," Spencer said, like a man who already knew what was coming and couldn't bear to hear it said out loud. Gideon, for his part, didn't perform. That was what made the whole evening so striking to anyone watching closely. He didn't parade Eleanor around the room or use her as a trophy on his arm. He stayed close, genuinely attentive, and when the evening's most formidable patron, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Whitley, approached and began asking Eleanor about the literacy nonprofit she ran out of a converted storefront in her neighborhood, Gideon simply stepped back and let her talk, let her shine. He brought her a glass of sparkling water without being asked, because he'd noticed her hands were empty and she hadn't wanted to interrupt her own conversation to find a waiter. "You didn't have to do that," she said when Mrs. Whitley finally moved on. "I know," he said simply. She studied him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because in 38 years of walking into rooms exactly like this one," he said, "I have never once met a woman crying on a curb who made me want to know everything about her life before she'd even told me her name." He paused, something careful crossing his expression. "I think I was supposed to be late tonight. For a reason." Eleanor's heart did something complicated, something she didn't have a word for yet. She looked away first. Spencer found her alone near the terrace doors. 20 minutes later, his tie loosened, a third drink in his hand he clearly shouldn't have had. Eleanor. He said her name carefully, like he was testing whether she'd even turn around. She turned, and the look on her face stopped him cold, not anger, which would have been easier, which would have meant she still cared enough to fight. What she gave him instead was something stiller and far more final. The look of a woman who had already done her grieving and come out the other side of it. "You look like someone I don't have any right to be standing in front of," he said, Funny, she said. You had plenty to say in our kitchen 2 hours ago. His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to a room he couldn't control, and tonight he had none left. If I'd seen what was actually standing in front of me, he started, his voice cracking at the edges. Eleanor, you are the biggest mistake of my life. I let myself get distracted by something easiest, the realest thing I'll ever have at home, and I treated it like furniture. He pressed a hand over his mouth for a second. I'm sorry. I am so sorry for what I did to you tonight, and every night before it. I believe you, Eleanor said. But sorry doesn't unset a table, Spencer. She opened her clutch and drew out the folded papers, the ones he'd left on top of her wedding napkins less than 3 hours earlier, and laid them flat on the small table between them. I'm signing these, she said. Now. She took the pen from his breast pocket before he could offer it, and signed her name on the line in a hand that didn't shake, slid the papers back across the table, and watched something in his face finally break. It was at that exact moment that Gideon appeared at her side, and Spencer's expression changed again. Because Spencer, as the managing director of his firm's development arm, knew precisely who Gideon Wren was. He'd spent the last 6 weeks preparing for tomorrow morning's closing meeting, the one where Wren Capital was set to finalize the largest investment his company had ever secured. $52 million, the deal that was supposed to define the next decade of his career. Gideon looked at him with the measured calm of a man holding every card and feeling no need to show a single one. Spencer Wade, he said, we have a closing meeting at 9 tomorrow. We do. Spencer straightened, attempting composure he didn't have left. I had no idea you knew my wife. Your wife, Gideon repeated, not unkindly but precisely. Eleanor and I met this evening. His eyes moved to her, something warm flickering through them before he turned back. I should mention, my legal team finalized an addendum to tomorrow's agreement this afternoon. A new clause. It requires that any lead partner on a deal funded by Wren Capital maintain a demonstrable standard of personal integrity, both professional and otherwise. We added it after our last partnership was compromised by a man's private conduct, becoming public in a way that reflected badly on everyone involved. He paused, his gaze steady on Spencer's face. After what I've personally witnessed tonight, I'm afraid that deal is dead. The clause has been triggered. The color drained out of Spencer's face entirely. We can discuss terms tomorrow. There's nothing left to discuss, Gideon said, his voice quiet and absolutely final. My office will send formal notice in the morning. Spencer stood frozen, the signed divorce papers in one hand, $52 million of his professional future dissolving in the other. That was when Betrayal arrived, having heard most of it. Her champagne flute hung loosely between 2 fingers, her composure entirely gone. Spencer. Her voice was sharp, thin. The deal is canceled? Betrayal, I can explain. She laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. Can you, though? Her voice dropped low and controlled and cutting. Because here's something you should know before I walk out of here. I have never loved you. Not once. Not for a single day. Spencer stared at her like she'd struck him. I was with you for what you had, she said. The title. The money. The version of your life I thought I was buying into. She set her glass down on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. And now look at you. You have nothing left that I came for, Spencer. And I have never once in my life stayed anywhere for nothing. She looked at him one final time. Not angry, not guilty, just coldly finished, and walked away without looking back. Spencer stood alone, holding a signed divorce document in one hand, the wreckage of his career in the other, finally understanding the full weight of what he'd built and then thrown away with his own hands. There's a word people reach for in moments like that. But justice rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it's just the quiet, total collapse of everything a man built on the wrong foundation. Every consequence finding its way back to the door it came from. Gideon turned to Eleanor, his expression softening completely. Shall we? She took his arm, and they walked away from Spencer Wade, who stood holding signed divorce papers in one hand and the ruins of his future in the other, and did not look back once. Later, when the gala had thinned to its last and most important hour, Gideon found Eleanor on the terrace looking out over the lit-up skyline, her wrap pulled around her shoulders against the night air. How are you? He asked, not quite a question. Lighter, she said, and meant it completely. He stood beside her in comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who feel they've already said the important things without needing to say them out loud. "I meant what I told you earlier," he said finally, "about being late for a reason." She turned to look at him, and something in his expression had shifted, the look of a man who'd been waiting a long time to say something, and had only just found the moment for it. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" he said. She waited. "I bought a ring 3 years ago," he said. "Not for anyone specific. I didn't even know her yet. I walked past a jeweler's window one ordinary Tuesday, and something about it stopped me cold." He exhaled, almost embarrassed by the memory. "I thought, whoever she turns out to be, she won't need it to shout. She'll just need it to be real. I've carried it ever since." Waiting for something I didn't have a name for, he looked at her. Until tonight, he reached into his jacket. The ring was simple and extraordinary at once. A single clean stone, no excess. The kind of choice made by someone who understood that real elegance never needs to announce itself. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know tonight has been more than enough without me adding to it. I know you're a woman who doesn't need rescuing, and I want to be very clear that this isn't that." His eyes stayed steady on hers. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, except this. Will you let me spend whatever time it takes to become a man who deserves you? Will you give me the chance to show you what it looks like to be seen completely and chosen on purpose?" The terrace had gone still. The city hummed quietly below them. Eleanor looked at the ring, then at him. She thought of the curb, the cold, her mother's note folded inside a garment bag for 4 years, waiting for exactly this kind of night. For the night you forget who you are and need reminding. She remembered now. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger, and in full view of the terrace doors, where Spencer Wade stood frozen with tears in his eyes, and a signed divorce decree still clutched in his shaking hand, Gideon cupped Eleanor's face and kissed her. It wasn't a performance for the room. It was simply a beginning. On the other side of the glass, Spencer watched the woman he'd thrown away become someone else's whole world, and he wept the way he hadn't wept since he was a boy. Not for her, because it was far too late for that, but for the version of his own life that had just closed its doors permanently. In full view of everyone he knew, beside him there was no one. Betrayal was already gone. 16 months later, Eleanor Pierce stood at the front of a sunlit chapel in the Vermont countryside, ivory lace at her wrists, her mother's favorite white roses woven through her hair, and watched Gideon walk toward her with the certainty of a man who'd known this was coming since a cold March night on a city curb. They were married on a Saturday in late spring, light pouring gold through the chapel windows, and everyone in that room felt the particular, rare joy of two people who'd found each other not in spite of a terrible night, but somehow because of it. The following winter, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margot, after Eleanor's mother, whose handwritten note still lived folded inside a small frame on Eleanor's dresser. Gideon held his daughter in the hospital room, with the stunned expression of a man who couldn't quite believe his own luck. And when Eleanor looked at him from the bed, tired and radiant, and more entirely herself than she'd ever been, she understood that luck had nothing to do with any of it. They had simply chosen each other, completely, on purpose. As for Spencer Wade, the firm didn't survive the collapse deal. $52 million had been the foundation everything else stood on, and without it, the rest came down in pieces. Clients followed the confidence out the door, and the confidence had left the building. The night Spencer stood, holding signed divorce papers, and watched his wife walk away on another man's arm, he sold the house, then the car. Then, slowly, the things he'd bought to fill a space a good marriage would have occupied. Betrayal never came back. He lived alone now in a modest apartment, not broken exactly, but emptied, quieted by the particular permanent weight of a man who'd had everything and chosen, with his own 2 hands, to throw it away for nothing of any lasting value. Sometimes he'd see Eleanor's name in the paper, attached now to Gideon's, to the literacy centers the Wren Foundation was funding across 3 states, to photographs of her laughing, speaking, holding her daughter with Gideon's arm around her shoulders, both of them looking at each other the way Spencer had never once looked at her. And every single time, he understood a little more clearly that the life he had now was exactly, precisely the life he'd built. A year after the wedding, Eleanor stood at the front of a new literacy center in her old neighborhood. The first of several, the foundation, was opening that spring. Children filled the folding chairs. Teachers she'd personally trained stood at the front of rooms that still smelled like fresh paint and new books. Mrs. Whitley was there. Eleanor's sister was there, laughing too loudly at something near the back and making no apology for it. Gideon stood near the door, watching his wife speak with the quiet certainty of a man who knew, without question, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Eleanor caught his eye from the podium. He smiled. She smiled back. The real kind, the kind her face had been saving up for a very long time. For just a moment she thought of a curb in the cold, of divorce papers left on top of unused wedding napkins, of a door closing softly behind a man who hadn't even looked back. She hadn't planned any of it, but she'd been ready for all of it long before she knew she was, and that, she understood now, had been the whole point.